Dr. Emily Carter's phone rang just before dawn. The city's local sheriff, Danny Blake, was on the other end. His voice was strained, and his usual southern drawl was tinged with urgency. "Dr. Carter, we've got a problem. People are disappearing around the LaLaurie Mansion, and there's talk of ghosts and curses. We need your team." Emily had heard of the mansion's dark reputation. Once a place of unspeakable cruelty, now a breeding ground for supernatural phenomena. She quickly assembled her team: Derek Matthews, with his impressive array of ghost hunting gear; Lila Moreno, whose psychic abilities made her an asset in dealing with spirits; and Agent Brian Holt, who had been assigned to provide support and ensure federal interests were protected. The team arrived in New Orleans under a canopy of humidity and mystery. As they approached the mansion, Derek eyed the place with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "It's always the creepy ones that get you," he quipped, adjusting his EMF meter. Lila was more somber. "I can already feel the energy. Something is very wrong here." Sheriff Blake met them at the entrance, his face lined with exhaustion. "The locals are scared, and honestly, so am I. We've got reports of skinwalkers and crawlers. People are vanishing, and the city's police are either too corrupt or too scared to help." Emily nodded, her expression serious. "We'll need access to the mansion and any records you have on recent disappearances." Blake handed over a folder filled with reports and witness statements. "Be careful. This place, it's not just the history. There's something active here." Inside, the mansion was a maze of rotting wood and faded grandeur. Dust particles danced in the slivers of light, cutting through the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with an oppressive weight. Emily turned to her team. "All right, let's split up. Derek and I will set up the equipment in the main hall. Lila, you take the second floor and try to make contact with any spirits. Brian, you'll assist wherever needed." As Derek and Emily worked to calibrate the ghost hunting equipment, Derek muttered, "You know, I always wanted to visit New Orleans, but I didn't think it would be under these circumstances." Emily gave a wry smile. "Isn't it just perfect? Nothing like a haunted mansion to kick off a vacation." Meanwhile, Lila ascended the grand staircase, her fingers grazing the banister as she felt the cold brush of unseen hands. She reached the second floor, where the temperature dropped dramatically. Shadows seemed to whisper and slither along the walls. Her eyes widened as she saw dark shapes darting around her. "Is anyone there?" Lila's voice trembled as she tried to communicate with the spirits. The temperature dropped further, and an icy breath brushed her neck. The response came, a low, guttural voice that murmured, "Help us." Back downstairs, Derek's equipment began to go haywire. The EMF meters spiked erratically, and the infrared cameras captured fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures. He exchanged glances with Emily. "Something's definitely off. We need to check in with Lila." The team regrouped, Lila visibly shaken. "There's something up here." I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The spirits, they're restless. Emily took a deep breath. "All right, let's head back to the main hall and review the footage. If there's a pattern, we need to find it." As they reviewed the footage, Brian's phone buzzed. It was an alert from the local police. A missing person had been reported near the mansion. The case was connected to the growing list of disappearances. The plot thickened, revealing a sinister pattern of people vanishing around the mansion in a recurring cycle. Emily frowned. "This isn't just a haunting. There's something deliberate happening here. We need to investigate further." Sheriff Blake returned with an additional set of documents and a grim expression. "I've got more intel. There's a history of corruption within the local police force. Some believe it's tied to the mansion's dark past." As night fell, the mansion seemed to come alive with malevolent energy. Strange noises echoed through the halls, and the team could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful lurking in the shadows. Emily looked around at her team, their faces illuminated by the flickering lights. "We're dealing with something much more complex than we anticipated. Let's stay sharp and see if we can uncover the truth behind these disappearances." The mansion's haunted history was only beginning to unfold. and the team knew that they were about to confront the darkest aspects of its past. With their resolve set, they prepared to dive deeper into the mystery that surrounded the LaLaurie Mansion, knowing that the fight against the phantoms and corruption was just beginning. As twilight draped the LaLaurie Mansion in a veil of shadows, the oppressive air seemed to thicken, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. Emily Carter, Derek Matthews, Lila Moreno, and Agent Brian Holt prepared for a long night ahead. The mansion's eerie silence was punctuated by the occasional creak of its decaying timbers. Emily gathered her team in the grand hall, the vast space now dimly lit by their equipment. The mansion's grandeur was evident even in its dilapidated state. Ornate moldings, high ceilings, and faded grandeur spoke of a time long past. But there was little grandeur to be found in the palpable fear that hung in the air. "All right, everyone," Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "We need to identify any patterns in the paranormal activity. Lila, you mentioned feeling dread on the second floor. Derek, any anomalies with the equipment?" Derek adjusted his EMF meter, which was still picking up erratic spikes. "Yeah, the meters are all over the place. We're getting more than just your standard ghostly interference. This place feels like it's pulsing with something wrong." Lila, her eyes scanning the darkened corners of the hall, nodded in agreement. "I felt a strong presence. It wasn't just fear, it was anger. Something here is trying to communicate, but it's hostile." Brian, who had been observing quietly, added, "And don't forget about the corruption angle. I got some additional intel from the sheriff. It seems that the disappearances are linked to a series of shady deals involving some of the local authorities." Emily raised an eyebrow. "So we're not just dealing with a haunting. There's also a human element, corruption, and maybe even a cover-up." Brian nodded. "Exactly. The deeper we dig, the more tangled it gets. If the locals are involved, it could mean that the disappearances aren't just random but part of a larger, more sinister scheme." The team decided to split up to cover more ground. Emily and Derek would continue their investigation in the basement, which had been reported as particularly active. Lila and Brian would investigate the second floor, where Lila had felt the strongest supernatural presence. In the basement, Emily and Derek descended the creaky stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and utility closets. Dust motes danced in the beam of their flashlights, and the musty smell of mildew filled the air. Derek set up a series of motion detectors and infrared cameras, while Emily reviewed the data collected so far. "It's like setting up for a sci-fi movie," Derek muttered, trying to lighten the mood. "If I had a nickel for every time I think I heard something, I'd be retired by now." Emily managed a small smile. "Just remember, this isn't Hollywood. We need to stay focused." As they moved deeper into the basement, the temperature dropped noticeably. Emily's breath became visible in the air, and the hairs on her arms stood on end. They reached a door marked "Restricted Access" that had been boarded up. Emily frowned at the sight. "This door wasn't on the blueprints," she said, examining the ancient, dust-covered lock. "Let's see what's behind it." With some effort, Derek pried the boards away, revealing a dark, cramped room filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder still, and the EMF meter went wild. Emily's flashlight flickered over the room's contents. Old trunks, a tattered armchair, and what appeared to be an old ledger. Derek approached the ledger cautiously. "Looks like something straight out of a horror movie." Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the ledger. "It might be exactly what we need." They carefully opened the ledger to reveal handwritten notes and records, but most were faded and nearly illegible. Emily began to decipher what she could, her brow furrowing as she made out references to punishments and unfortunate incidents. Meanwhile, Lila and Brian were on the second floor, where the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on them. Lila's face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously as she navigated the dimly lit corridors. "Are you sure you want to go in there?" Brian asked, glancing at a particularly dark room. "I mean, it looks like something straight out of a Stephen King novel." Lila forced a smile. It's either that or wait in the dark. I'd prefer to confront whatever's here. They entered the room, and Lila immediately felt a rush of cold energy. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and an inexplicable sadness washed over her. She set up her spirit box and began trying to communicate. "Is there anyone here who wants to talk?" Lila asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Please come forward." The spirit box crackled to life, emitting a series of unintelligible noises before settling into a chillingly clear voice. "Help us," Lila gasped. "Did you hear that?" Brian nodded, his skepticism momentarily forgotten. "I heard it, but who are they asking for help from?" The room seemed to grow colder, and a shadowy figure appeared briefly in the corner of Brian's vision before vanishing. He snapped a photo, but the figure did not appear in the shot. "This is getting intense," Brian said, his voice low. "We need to figure out what this means." Back in the basement, Emily and Derek's exploration of the ledger revealed disturbing details about experimental punishments and disappearances tied to the mansion. The evidence pointed to a deeply embedded corruption that extended far beyond mere ghosts. "This ledger could be the key to understanding the recent disappearances," Emily said, her tone serious. "If this is correct, there's more to this story than a haunted house." As the night wore on, the team reassembled, their faces reflecting the strain of their discoveries. The mansion's secrets were unfolding, revealing a dark tapestry of corruption and malevolence. Emily looked at her team, the weight of their findings heavy in her eyes. "We have a lot of work ahead of us. If we're going to solve this, we need to dig deeper into both the supernatural and the human elements." The shadows in the LaLaurie Mansion seemed to draw closer, their whispers growing louder, as if the very walls were conspiring to keep their secrets hidden. The team prepared for the challenges ahead, knowing that the fight against the phantoms and the corruption would be their most formidable yet. The morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the LaLaurie Mansion, casting long shadows across the grand hallway. Emily Carter, Derek Matthews, Lila Moreno, and Agent Brian Holt gathered in the mansion's dusty library, now their operational headquarters. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and must, mixing with the lingering fear from the previous night's investigation. "All right, team," Emily said, her voice carrying a hint of fatigue. "We've uncovered some unsettling information. The ledger Derek and I found points to an organized system of punishment and disappearance linked to the mansion's past. It's not just ghosts we're dealing with, but a web of historical corruption." Derek nodded, holding up a photograph of a particularly disturbing ledger entry. This entry details punishments carried out in the mansion. It talks about removing the troublesome and dealing with dissenters. It seems like the mansion was more than just a house. It was a place of dark rituals. Brian, who had been reviewing some of the evidence collected from the previous night, looked up. The sheriff confirmed that these records were never public. They've been hidden or destroyed. It's clear that someone doesn't want this information to come out. Lila, who had been quietly examining her notes, added, "And the spirit box responses were unsettling. They talked about help and release. It's as if the souls trapped here are reaching out, trying to communicate their suffering." The team's mood grew somber as they discussed their findings. The mansion's dark history seemed to be entwined with the present, creating a nightmarish reality that was more than just supernatural occurrences. "Let's head back to the scene of the activity," Emily suggested, breaking the silence. "We need to gather more data and see if we can make contact with whatever is causing these disturbances." As they prepared for their second night of investigation, the team equipped themselves with the latest ghost hunting technology, infrared cameras, EVP recorders, and motion sensors. They also brought along a new addition, a team of paranormal investigators specializing in demonic activity. The sun set quickly over the mansion, enveloping it in a chilling darkness. The team reconvened in the grand hall before splitting up again. Emily and Derek would investigate the library, where they had previously encountered unsettling phenomena. Lila and Brian would revisit the second floor to continue their attempts to communicate with the spirits. In the library, Emily and Derek set up their equipment, scanning the room for any signs of paranormal activity. The room was filled with old, leather-bound books and ancient artifacts. Dust settled on everything, giving the space an aura of neglect and decay. "Remember the last time we were in here?" Derek said, attempting to lighten the mood. "It felt like the walls were closing in on us." Emily chuckled dryly. "You mean when we thought we were about to meet our end by a ghost with a serious grudge?" Derek smirked. "Yeah, something like that. Let's hope this time we don't end up as ghost bait." As they began their investigation, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Emily's breath formed visible puffs in the cold air. The EMF meter started to beep erratically, indicating increased electromagnetic activity. "This is it," Emily said, her tone serious. "Let's see if we can make contact." Derek adjusted the EVP recorder and began asking questions. "Is there anyone here with us? Can you tell us why you're still here?" The recorder crackled to life with faint, garbled responses, but nothing clear enough to understand. The tension was palpable as they waited for something definitive. Meanwhile, Lila and Brian explored the second floor, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. The second floor was eerily quiet, with only the creaking of the old wooden floorboards under their feet. Lila set up her spirit box and began the communication process once more. "We're here to help. Can you tell us what's keeping you here?" The spirit box emitted a chilling, distorted voice. "Leave now." Brian, who had been studying the room's layout, frowned. "It sounds like they're desperate for us to leave." "What does that mean?" Lila shook her head. "It's hard to say. They might be trying to protect us from something worse." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Brian and Lila exchanged worried glances. "Let's check it out," Brian said, his voice taut with concern. As they moved towards the source of the noise, the temperature plummeted, and an unsettling feeling washed over them. The shadows in the corridor seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. Brian's flashlight flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow on the walls. When they arrived at the end of the corridor, they found nothing but an overturned chair and a broken lamp. Lila's face was pale. "This feels wrong. We should get back to Emily and Derek." Back in the library, Emily and Derek had not had much success in their attempts to contact the spirits. The room was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional beep of the EMF meter. "It's like the place is holding its breath," Emily said, frustration evident in her voice. "We're missing something." Derek nodded. "Yeah, and whatever it is, it's probably right under our noses." The team regrouped, their faces reflecting the strain of their investigation. The mansion's secrets seemed to be deeper and darker than they had anticipated. They knew they had to press on, despite the mounting dangers and the unsettling feeling that something was watching them. Emily looked at her team with a resolute expression. "We need to find out what's keeping these spirits bound to this place. If we can understand their past, maybe we can help them and ourselves." The LaLaurie Mansion loomed around them, its dark corridors and hidden rooms concealing secrets that were yet to be uncovered. The team prepared for another night of investigation, knowing that the phantoms of the past were not going to make their task any easier. The dim light of the waning moon filtered through the dirty windows of the LaLaurie Mansion, casting long, twisting shadows across the grimy floors. The mansion was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The team, exhausted but determined, reconvened in the grand hall. Their faces were pale, marked by sleepless nights and unnerving encounters. Emily Carter, Derek Matthews, Lila Moreno, and Brian Holt were now joined by Dr. Iris Blake, a historian specializing in occult practices. Dr. Blake had been called in to provide insight into the mansion's dark history and the disturbing rituals that had taken place there. "Well," Dr. Blake said, breaking the silence, "what have we discovered so far? I've heard quite a bit about this place, and frankly, I'm more than a little intrigued and disturbed." Emily sighed and gestured to a table covered with old documents, photographs, and ghost hunting equipment. "We've found records of disturbing rituals and punishments. The ledger we uncovered mentioned the removal of those who interfered. It suggests a systematic approach to dealing with dissenters. Last night, we encountered some of the spirits. They seemed desperate and frightened. Dr. Blake examined the documents closely. This mansion was notorious for its secrecy. The LaLaurie family was known for their cruelty, and many believe that their actions have left a lasting mark on this place. But there's more to this story. The spirits are not merely seeking vengeance. They're trapped. Brian, who had been silently reviewing the evidence from the previous night, looked up. We've also encountered several phenomena that suggest we're dealing with something beyond typical hauntings. Skinwalkers, crawlers. These are entities known for their malevolent and predatory nature. Dr. Blake nodded thoughtfully. Yes, the presence of such entities indicates that the mansion's dark history may have attracted or created these beings. They feed on fear and suffering, amplifying the turmoil of the spirits here. Sounds like a vacation spot for the worst kind of company, Derek remarked, attempting to lighten the mood. But seriously, how do we deal with something like this? Dr. Blake frowned. The first step is to understand the nature of these entities and their connection to the mansion's history. We need to delve deeper into the rituals performed here and see if there's a way to sever the connection. The team prepared for another night of investigation. This time, their approach was more strategic. They decided to focus on the basement, which had been eerily quiet, but was crucial to understanding the mansion's dark past. The basement was known for its storage rooms and old servants' quarters, where many of the darker rituals were believed to have occurred. As they descended the stairs into the musty darkness of the basement, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Emily led the way, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive blackness. Derek set up motion sensors and began to scan the area with the EMF meter. "Keep your eyes and ears open," he said. "If anything's going to show up, it'll be here." Lila and Brian followed closely, their flashlights revealing old storage crates and cobweb-covered furniture. Lila carried the spirit box, hoping to make contact with any lingering entities. "We're here to help," Lila spoke into the spirit box. "Can you tell us what happened here?" Static crackled, and then a faint, distorted voice emerged. "Help trapped." Emily's heart raced as she listened to the response. "We need to find out what's keeping them trapped. It's clear that they're in distress." Suddenly, a loud, guttural noise echoed through the basement. The team tensed, their flashlights darting around the room. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, flickering and distorting. "Did anyone else hear that?" Brian asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Yeah," Derek replied, his face set in grim determination. "We need to investigate." As they moved deeper into the basement, the shadows seemed to coalesce into darker, more defined shapes. The air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. The motion sensors began to beep erratically, indicating high levels of electromagnetic activity. Emily approached an old, iron door that seemed to have been sealed for years. This could be it. This door might lead to something significant. With some effort, Derek managed to pry the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a small, dank room filled with old ritualistic items. Candles, symbols etched into the walls, and an old altar. "This looks like it's straight out of a horror movie," Derek said, his voice laced with unease. "But we need to understand it." Dr. Blake carefully examined the symbols on the walls. These are ritualistic sigils meant to bind or control entities. If we can decipher them, we might find a way to break the binding. Emily set up the infrared camera and began to document the room. The atmosphere was tense, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of their vision, and whispers echoed softly. Suddenly, a shadowy figure materialized in the doorway, its form indistinct but radiating malevolence. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on a shape. The team's breath caught in their throats as they prepared for what was to come. "Stay calm," Emily instructed, her voice steady. "We need to focus on the task." The figure moved towards them, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The motion sensors went wild, and the spirit box crackled with frantic, distorted voices. Leave now. The team knew they were facing something powerful and dangerous. With renewed determination, they worked to decipher the symbols and find a way to break the connection that held the spirits and entities bound to the mansion. The night stretched on, and the mansion's oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on them. The battle against the malevolent forces had only just begun, and the team knew they needed to uncover the mansion's darkest secrets to put an end to the terror that had gripped the LaLaurie Mansion for so long. The mansion's oppressive gloom seemed to tighten around the team as they prepared for what they hoped would be the final confrontation. Emily Carter, Derek Matthews, Lila Moreno, and Brian Holt, along with Dr. Iris Blake, had spent hours deciphering the arcane symbols and rituals that had plagued the LaLaurie Mansion for centuries. The haunting whispers had grown louder, more desperate. The once quiet basement had turned into a battleground between the living and the malevolent entities that had taken refuge there. The clock ticked ominously as the team gathered in the basement's ritual chamber, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their flashlights. The iron door, now ajar, revealed the grim artifacts of dark rites conducted long ago. Their goal was clear: to end the torment and dispel the malevolent entities once and for all. Dr. Blake was crouched over the ancient symbols, her flashlight casting a dim glow on the etched markings. These sigils were designed to bind entities. If we can reverse the ritual, we might be able to free the trapped souls and banish the demonic presence. Emily nodded, her gaze shifting to the spirit box and motion sensors. We've set up the equipment to detect any changes. If something happens, we need to be ready. The team was tense but resolute. Derek was preparing the ghost hunting equipment, while Brian and Lila monitored the readings. The air was cold and thick, with an almost palpable sense of dread. Lila, holding the spirit box, began to speak into it. We're here to end the suffering and set things right. If there's anyone who can hear us, please make your presence known. The spirit box crackled, and the air grew colder. A low, guttural growl filled the room, causing everyone to shiver. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, taking on darker, more sinister forms. The temperature dropped further, and the motion sensors began to beep wildly. "This is it," Derek said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of static and distant cries. "Prepare for anything." Dr. Blake began to trace the symbols with a chalky substance, murmuring incantations as she worked. The symbols glowed faintly, their ancient power responding to her efforts. Emily held the infrared camera steady, capturing every detail. The room seemed to pulse with dark energy, the oppressive weight of malevolence growing stronger. A dark figure materialized in the doorway, its shadowy form writhing and shifting. It radiated an intense malevolence, its presence like a void that swallowed light and hope. The figure advanced slowly, and the temperature plummeted further. The spirit box crackled with a desperate, distorted voice. "Leave this place now." Emily stepped forward, her voice resolute. "We're not leaving until we've put an end to this. We're here to free the trapped souls and banish the darkness." The dark figure seemed to grow more solid, its form taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It moved toward Dr. Blake, who was absorbed in her work, her face etched with concentration and determination. "Focus on the ritual," Emily said to Dr. Blake. "We'll handle the entity." Derek and Brian readied their ghost hunting equipment, preparing for a confrontation. The air was charged with a palpable sense of foreboding, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them. The dark figure lunged forward, and the room erupted into chaos. Derek's motion sensors went haywire, and the spirit box emitted a series of incoherent, terrifying noises. Brian struggled to keep his footing as the temperature continued to drop. "Hold your ground," Emily shouted. "We need to finish this." Dr. Blake continued her incantations, her voice growing stronger and more commanding. The symbols on the walls began to glow more brightly, their ancient power seeming to resonate with her words. The dark figure hesitated, its form flickering and wavering as if it were struggling against an unseen force. Emily and the team fought to maintain their focus, their breaths visible in the icy air. Shadows lashed out at them, and the air crackled with malevolent energy. The motion sensors continued to beep erratically, and the spirit box emitted desperate pleas. "Help us, release us." Dr. Blake's voice reached a crescendo as she completed the final part of the ritual. The symbols on the walls blazed with a blinding light, and the dark figure let out a deafening shriek. The room was filled with an intense, otherworldly light as the power of the ancient ritual surged forth. The dark figure writhed and twisted, its form distorting as if being pulled by an unseen force. The oppressive weight of the malevolent presence began to lift, and the temperature started to rise. The shadows seemed to retreat, their dark forms dissolving into nothingness. With one final, ear-splitting scream, the dark figure vanished. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy with the remnants of the struggle. The symbols on the walls faded, their power expended. Dr. Blake, breathing heavily, looked at the team with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's done. The ritual is complete. The entities are banished." Emily, Derek, Lila, and Brian exchanged weary but triumphant glances. The oppressive atmosphere of the mansion seemed to lift, and the air felt lighter. As they made their way out of the mansion, the first light of dawn began to filter through the grime-covered windows. The LaLaurie Mansion, once a place of darkness and despair, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The team had faced unimaginable horrors and had emerged victorious. They had freed the trapped souls and dispelled the malevolent entities that had haunted the mansion for so long. The LaLaurie Mansion's dark chapter had come to a close, and the echoes of its haunting past would fade into history.